welcome. We got a nice small crowd today, so we can be very informal. And my goal around this is this be your agenda, not mine. So we can go anywhere in this conversation that makes sense to you or that meets your needs. So there's really nothing off the table. Fair enough? So the starting place, we just, in response to the question about change processes and thinking about intersections as a way to do that, a way to think about it, and that the sort of simple intersection with the stop sign is really about reducing variance and increasing predictability, which has a role in some processes like attendance taking or emergency procedures. But when it's applied to instruction, once you've reduced the variance among classrooms, you don't have anywhere to go. You can't, that's a very low ceiling. And unfortunately, that's a strategy that's disproportionately applied to poor students, to minority students in urban settings. But it's not exclusively there. There are other places that have done that. Because you can get some improvement if you're coming from a point or state of chaos. So that's sort of one. A second level that we call transactional, but if you think about staying with the intersection, so now the state says we need to make our intersections safer. So the regulations are we're going to have to make the sign bigger, it's got to be higher, you got to put reflectors out there, there can't be any tree limbs within a certain number of feet of the stop sign. And the idea is to take a system we have and make it incrementally better. So there's a lot of work to be done on the provider side of getting that intersection ready, installing the reflectors, all those kind of things. From the driver's perspective, I still pull up to the stop sign, I look left, look right. When it's clear, I go forward. In other words, my experience fundamentally hasn't changed. In fact, the research just in terms of intersections is that when you do that work, initially you get some bump up because it's different. People notice the reflectors or they notice the painting on the pavement. But for people who go through that stop sign day in and day out, after a while, they don't see those things. They're right back to where they were. But the distractions that can sometimes create a hazard are gone, so you get some incremental benefit. If you think about this in schools, this is tantamount to buying new textbooks. So our bet might be we need more current information, that we need a better array of perspectives reflected, or we need something that's more engaging for kids. And there are other instances, but that's probably, new curriculum might be the same. From the learner's perspective, I've got a shiny new book and new content. But if the instructional process doesn't change, I'm still lectured at, do my homework, take a test, the outcome doesn't really change. What we get often are new books or new curriculum. You get this initial bump up because of the novelty. But as soon as it settles out, you tend to get about the same kind of results as we got before. But we spent money to try and get better. But from the learner's perspective, the fundamental experience is the same as it was before. So that's sort of the second. This is the more the transactional, if you think of HIFITs, the transactional kind, or even in Marzano and McNulty, this is sort of type 1. This is sort of getting better at what we've done before. It's okay, but it tends to be smaller increments. A third way of sort of thinking about the intersection is the traffic is such that we need to go beyond stop signs and put in a stop light. So putting in a stop light is really transformative for the providers. Now I've got to learn how to position stop lights. I've got to wire them. We have to coordinate them so anybody driving through, we get smooth traffic rolling through. So there's a lot of work, a lot of new skills, a lot of new work for the provider. As a driver, when I pull up to a stop sign, now I don't look left, right, left, and then go if it's clear. I stop and I wait until the light turns green. In many ways, a stoplight reduces my judgment rather than enhance it. In fact, I mean, all of us have sat at stop signs sometimes thinking they must be broken, or stoplights thinking they must be broken, because we're not in control. We're acting in less control than we were at the stop sign. Often, when the light turns green, we assume that everybody else is going to follow that same signal. We may pull out. If someone isn't, they T-bone us. And we think we were in the right. That's true, but it doesn't matter. And once an accident, if I'm dead, it doesn't matter. Who was right or who's wrong doesn't matter. That change process is tantamount to some extent of think about introducing technology. Often what happens is teachers have to learn a whole new set of processes, a whole new set of skills. But if all I do is take worksheets that used to be on paper and digitize them, I've not fundamentally changed the learner's experience. In fact, the research in terms of the introduction of technology in the United States largely follows that pattern. That we tend to do what we've always done, maybe with a little more efficiency, but the experience of technology has not fundamentally changed has not changed the learning experience for learners. Does that make sense? And there are other examples we could give of that, but that's kind of how that plays out. Which moves us then to the sort of transformational. Here, think roundabout. So roundabouts are not incremental improvement on the stop sign, stop light. Roundabouts start with a different question. How do we efficiently and safely move people through intersections that are inherently dangerous? So we're looking here for really two things, efficiency and also safety. So in a roundabout, the idea is that when you come up to the roundabout, you look to your left. If someone's coming, let them go. But as soon as it's comfortable and safe, enter the roundabout and then select your exit and you go. What's interesting about roundabouts is that rather than discouraging your judgment, it actually demands your judgment. You have to pay attention. So where in a stop sign or stop light, you can continue to text or doing whatever you want, roundabouts make that really hard because I've got to watch who's there and time my entry. That engagement of the driver makes intersections significantly less dangerous. In fact, the data on intersections, those sort of really violent T-bone crashes, are nearly eliminated because the angle of merging means that you're more likely to have a fender bender than a fatality. In fact, fatalities drop 90%. Just think about that. In roundabouts, they drop 90%. Just simply because the driver has to pay attention in terms of negotiating. Now, having said that, there are many people hate roundabouts for that very reason. It's different. It requires me to think. I used to be able to daydream my way through intersections, even though that was dangerous. But the primary reason why roundabouts are safer is that it changes the experience of the driver, requiring the driver to be more engaged, which means they're going to notice more. Now, they're also, by the way, more efficient than I saw this on Mythbusters, so I know it's true. You know Mythbusters? They do. So they lined up people up and then timed them. Basically what they found was you can get far more people through a roundabout in an hour than you can either a stop sign or a stop light. Simply because you don't stop and you can make your way through. In schools, and I would argue, so this is where the kind of learning we're talking about comes into play. This isn't about just incrementally making things a little better. This is about changing the experience of the learner. That invites, even requires the learner to be more actively engaged in the process. Now, my input, my thoughts, my judgment as a learner are valued and applied in the process, rather than there's an assumption that somebody else makes that decision and I just implement it. So just as a metaphor, so often what happens is we get caught up doing incremental or transactional change, or reducing variance, thinking that we're going to get redesign outcomes. But this is really about, so the shortcut's really the sort of the idea of the roundabout. But I was telling George on the way down that a few weeks ago I was doing a presentation in Chicago, and there was a guy there from Oakland. I don't know if either of you are from, you're both within, so this is someone from Oakland. It's like I laid this whole metaphor out, and we finished, he goes, you know, that's really interesting, because they built a roundabout near my house, okay, and then put up a stop sign. So when you come up to the roundabout, you still have to stop and then go in the right. So it's tantamount. Just think about this. Sometimes we do really innovative things in school, and then we cut off the benefit by putting back in place old structures. It's like, okay, we lost the benefit of the roundabout because what we did was supersede that with an old structure. So anyway, it's another way of sort of thinking about what's this layer of change we're talking about. And can get this sort of nice shortcut around it is this roundabout thinking? Or is this just stoplight thinking? Or is this just stop sign thinking? What are we thinking? What are we after here? And how do we know? What are the characteristics of what we're thinking about or talking about in terms of reducing variance, incremental improvement, or transformation for provider, read adults, but not necessary for learner, versus reconceptualizing the process that invites investment from all sides, and not only invites but requires the judgment and the investment of kids in the process. So you've heard this before, George. What did I forget? Okay, so I'll tell you the rest of the story. So the 5 Levers book, when we sent that in summer of 2013. This is sort of the story of writing books. So my assumption when we started the first book, and to some extent the second, is you've got this whole book. You can say anything, everything that you've ever thought about. You get it all together and you put it in the book and send it off. That's sort of the way this is supposed to work. Well, the way the publishing process goes is you keep working through drafts in terms of the manuscript, and then when you get to a point where the editor says, okay, we're close, you send it in, and then they have a copy editor who goes in and does all the kind of technical work and says, you know, this doesn't make sense, or this isn't, you need more clarity here. Then you have a process to go in and fix all that. They don't like you to do a lot, but you can add small parts. Then you sign off that, okay, this is the final manuscript, and you send it back to them, where they now start formatting and getting ready for the book. So Tony, my co-author, and I worked this all through, sent it in, got together about a week later, and this metaphor hit us. So it's not in the book. It was after. It's one of these things that's like, darn. It would have been a great opener for the book. And we talk about different kinds of change within it, but never thought of the metaphor until after it was over. So
the metaphor from that book that I've used several times as I think about things is changing, remodeling my kitchen.
Oh yeah.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll tell you I'll tell you the rest of the story about that. So while we were writing the book, Tony was actually remodeling his kitchen.
I was going to say when I was reading your book, so that helped.
Yes. So it was a substantial remodel, and if you ever remodel the kitchen, it's like, talk about disruption. I mean, it's awful. It's just awful. So, but they did a great job. I mean, the kitchen looked fabulous afterwards. And Tony has 2 children, Sam and Sarah. And Sam was probably, maybe 5th or 6th grade at this time. So they finished remodeling the kitchen. That's all done. And they had the first big dinner out of the new kitchen. So Jenny makes dinner. They set the table. Everything's there. They're partway through the dinner, and Sam goes, "Mom, this food tastes just like it tasted before." And it's like, in that context, we'd say, well, of course you wouldn't expect. It's not the kitchen that improves the taste. It's the ingredients. It's the process, all of which don't change just by remodeling the kitchen. Now, having said that, modern appliances, additional capacity can allow you to do some things you couldn't have done before that might result in better tasting food. But just because you have it doesn't mean that's the case. That if you've not changed anything else, the experience of the person eating the food is about what it was before. Yet in schools, we often get tied up with how much technology do you have? What are your class sizes?
Are you one-to-one?
Are you one-to-one? Are you doing formative assessments even though you may not use the information? I mean, it's all those kinds of things that we focus on that are like the kitchen. When in reality, it's what do you do with that data? To what extent is technology being used to help you be flexible in the way you engage kids and allowing kids to take more ownership for learning, all those kinds of things that technology allows, or the stuff allows, but doesn't in any way guarantee. But yeah, that's the... So it was actually Sam who said, "Mom, this food tastes just like it did before."
Can you talk to us a little bit about the question that we'll get is, so this isn't what college looks like. So
Yeah, love it. It's become one of my favorite questions. Because parents often say, well, this kind of learning isn't what they're going to be expected to do in college. They're going to be in a room with 300 people and they've got to be able to listen to a lecture. And so we should be teaching them that way, so they're ready. Well, I mean, it turns out that actually this sort of learning gives learners more flexibility in how they learn and allows them to make choices about their learning that are not dependent on the teaching. So for example, if I'm in a large group and lecturing is not the way I'm going to learn, what I might do is simply write down the big topics and then go out and find YouTube videos. I might go find other resources to help me do that. It may be that I really need to hear it twice. I might record the lecture and get at it later. I might form a group of learners who are also in there, and we meet immediately after to discuss and learn from each other. The point is that lecture is only one way of instruction, but learners have multiple choices when it comes to learning. Our job is to help learners build the sort of toolkit they have so that regardless of the sort of instruction situation they're in, they can learn, including, by the way, when there is no teacher. So, and by the way, what we found is our learners do really well because they understand that this work is about learning, not about the teaching. That my responsibility is my learning, and I have strategies to do that. The one problem we have bumped into is that often learners who learn in this way also become really good at self-advocacy. And so we've had some of our students who later go up to the professor and say, by the way, if you teach it this way, I think more of us would be learning. And professors are well known for not taking that sort of feedback very well. So that's sort of one. Here's the second. This sort of learning helps learners develop a clear sense of purpose. So when they go off to college, they go with greater learning purpose. And it often puts them in circumstances where they struggle with their learning, where they have to struggle to succeed. The experience of far too many high school students who go to college is that they get there and suddenly the learning expectations are different. Students who've breezed through elementary, middle, and high school suddenly find themselves in college struggling and not being prepared for it. Unfortunately, they often assume that it means they've hit their ceiling, that they're not capable there, and so they bail out. Or they go through school, kids go through school not having a sense of purpose, getting to college thinking purpose will emerge, and it doesn't. And so we have this ridiculous dropout phenomenon after the first semester, first year, or into the second year. So the sort of shortcut tongue-in-cheek to parents is that this kind of learning, if their child's going off to college, is the best guarantee they won't be living in your basement at the age of 24. Because this increases the likelihood they'll be able to survive and thrive in that learning environment, as opposed to we make a bet on a lecture, when in fact, even though that's the primary instructional process, it's not their expectation from a learning process. They expect much more dynamic, much more self-initiated learning than would be implied by their instructional processes. And as they become farther, as they move farther into a major or an area, the instruction also changes. But for learners who've developed this sort of learning skill set, it's far easier later to make the adjustment, regardless of what that becomes. Whether that's blended or online or lecture-based or small group, whatever that might be, it's much better, it's much easier for them to make the transition. So for me, when parents say, well, I don't know, what does this mean for college? It's like, whoa, that's a great question. And there is a great answer. It reduces the risk that your child's going to go off and boomerang back.
Well, and I would argue that I don't think they get on lecture anymore. I mean,
I don't either.
When I go back, think about my experience, and that's been 30 years ago, you had some professors that came in and wrote an assignment on the board and left.
That was it, right?
You had some that lectured over the content and then gave a study guide, and
yes.
it was not related to the
It didn't matter at all, right? They just talked about what they wanted to talk about.
So you really had to be a self-directed learner. So I think it really prepares them
yes.
in a much stronger way.
In fact, I'll tell you a story. So about a year and a half ago, it was spring of 16. So we're in Wisconsin, and our flagship is the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Somehow I came across a flyer that they were going to have a one-day seminar on personalized learning. So you can imagine, for me, it's like, whoa, I've got to get, well, it turns out it's just for professors, assistant professors, lecturers. But I wheedled an invitation anyway. So, because I just thought, what could this be? Well, it turns out that the day was more about how can we create flexibility beyond the lecture in order to engage learners. There would have been it would have been a more accurate descriptor if they had said this is about student engagement, because what they're finding is kids aren't. And I came away that day with really a better appreciation for the challenge that professors face, but also disheartened by the sort of limited amount of response that's there. But I'll give you just a couple. So one of the deans, she was new to the department as a dean, decided that during that year she would visit every classroom in her department to just get a sense for what's going on. And so she would wait till the class started, come in and sit down in the back to just observe. And what that meant was every student with technology, and virtually every student had it, had their technology out while the class was going on. And her report was virtually no students had their technology connected to anything that was going on in the lesson. In fact, technology in this case was decreasing the amount of engagement, not increasing it. Because kids were using it to shop, to do solitaire, to do any one of a number of things that had nothing to do with the lesson. So in this case, it was really not an advantage at all, it was a disadvantage. One of the professors talked about how he dealt with it. Was he told people that if you have technology in his class, you must be using it to take notes or do something directly related to the lesson. And then 3 weeks in, he has his grad students sort of sit in the back and watch. And at 3 weeks in, if they find a student who's not, they just move them out. Okay, so just think about, it's like, wait, these are adults. What was missing far too much was any recognition on the behalf of the professor that it's their instruction that likely will have an impact on what kids are doing. It was all about how do we control them, not how do we influence them. Having said that, there was one of the professors talked about, he has 6 sections, I think 5 or 6 sections. No, he has 3 sections of 300 students. Now, from the university's perspective, those are big cash cow classes, because every one of those students paid full freight for the credits but we're only paying one instructor. So, and they typically are they're lower classmen. And he said, my struggle is, what do I do? And he said, it's not possible for me to know every one of those students. That's just not, there are, whatever that is, 900 learners. But what he did do was break up his class. So throughout the lessons, there were clusters of kids sitting, so they at least knew each other. They had some sense of belonging, even though he wasn't necessarily in a position to negotiate all of those relationships with the kids. And what he found was he gets better attendance, that kids tend to do better on tests, because what's happening is they're at least processing the information as it's being distributed in real time. That I thought was great. So it's short of personalized learning, but at least he's creating an environment within which there's some sense of belonging, some sense of connection, and an opportunity to learn from each other. But I just thought it was an amazing day on that side. Their problem is they have kids whose bodies are showing up, but their minds aren't there. And they're realizing that's a big problem for them. And that technology is not solving that problem at all. And they're not, and so, it was not a conference filled with solutions. It was some better definition of the problem and some possible strategies, but not a lot beyond that. So it's an interesting one that they're becoming cognizant of, that what they're doing not only isn't working, it isn't even working as well as it used to, because kids have more sources of distraction. So they come, I think Phil Schlechte says, you can mandate the seat in the chair, but the mind is voluntary. And that's what they're running into. So.
Engagement. That seems to be the elusive tail we're chasing all the time.
Yep.
I know that's not the golden nugget as far as you see it. So could you...
No. When we started this work, we thought it was. We thought one of the tenets of this work needed to be student engagement. And what we realized as we started down that path was, one, engagement doesn't equal learning. That there are times when kids are engaged for reasons other than learning. So if you wind the clock way back to, in the 1980s, Madeline Hunter was sort of the guru of effective instruction. And Dr. Hunter had a statement that she said there's learning and then there's activitying. And you don't understand that, and what you're seeing is not always readily apparent. Just because you go into a room and kids are actively doing things doesn't mean learning is happening. That engagement is really focused on the learning task, not just on doing things. But the value of engagement is that it opens the door for the things that really do count when it comes to learning. So about 3 or 4 years ago, actually wrote a white paper on what we called the learning independence continuum. And it's really this idea that learning starts with motivation. And motivation can be natural interest, it can be stimulated interest, it can be coercive. You can create, but engagement is really motivation in action. So motivation is the inclination to do something, openness to do something. Engagement is actually acting on it. And so motivation is the opportunity. Engagement is the sort of, I'm going to act on this so something starts to happen. The benefit of engagement is actually the coaching you can do with it. Because as kids are engaged, you can start to point out strategies they're using, the extent to which the effort they're giving is taking them where they need to go. You can help them be more cognizant of the resources that are available to support their learning, which is really moving them towards efficacy. That engagement itself is this sort of physical or emotional or psychological cognitive commitment to do something. Efficacy is this sort of, how do I take that energy now and make it more purposeful and focused? And so that's why the sort of feedback we give to kids is really important. That is, what do I point out that's going on? It's the why do I focus on the effort, not on the product? Because the effort is the capacity, the product is just an outcome. But the coaching we do around efficacy helps learners understand that it's their efforts, it's their thinking that generated the learning. Hence, they own that learning. That moves it away from learning is something I do because adults demand it, expect it. More into learning is the byproduct, or is the product of the effort I gave. And the quality of my effort, the intensity of sort of my focus, and the extent to which I use the resources I have, creates a product, creates an outcome for me that I own. And by the way, we found, particularly with students from high poverty, that this idea of learning is something no one can take from you is an important concept. In fact, I'll tell you a quick side story. So our daughter for a while taught in an inner city Milwaukee school. And she came from a place that was very diverse but not high poverty. And there was this old school, pretty traditional. There was a bump out closet on the side that the doors, are we at a time we're supposed to see someone else coming?
Close.
Okay, here's the point. Kids said, Miss Rickabaugh, why aren't you better watch your stuff closer. You're not paying attention to your stuff. What was happening was kids were constantly monitoring the closet. Well, what was happening is they wanted to make sure nobody took their stuff. This whole idea of ownership. The benefit of focusing on ownership is that it now moves you to be able to coach kids for independence. If they own the learning, now there's a reason for them to develop a skill set that allows them to be independent. So this whole idea is that engagement is important, but it's an entry point. It's not a holy grail. So, okay, is it time for the next one?